A very good evening to you. I'm Lisa Lord, and my special guest is the Director General of the Barbados Red Cross Society, Miss Danielle Toppin. Thank you so much for joining us on the program. Now, you were appointed to the head of the local Red Cross a year ago, and this was historic because you are the first woman to become Director General. But who's Danielle Toppin? What's your background?
Most of my professional experience was in Jamaica, background in gender and development studies. I taught at UE Mona in the gender department. Worked a lot with a group called Sistren, using it's called edutainment, arts in community development, youth development. And I moved home 2000 and about 7-8 years ago to work on a project that was being run, which was gender. My focus was the gender specialist, and it was an agricultural project. So it was really about supporting agricultural entrepreneurs, agripreneurs throughout the region, which was funded by it was then CEDA, it's now DFATD.
But how do you get into an organization that's dealing with crises?
I answered an ad. There was a Zika project, and there was an ad for a project manager because that project that brought me home ended. And there was an ad for a project manager for this Zika project. This was a Zika response project. I answered it, and late Edmund Bradshaw interviewed me, and I was appointed as project manager. When Mr. Bradshaw passed, I was still working, doing a lot of project work and working with various projects. And in time, I guess it evolved.
So just to put things in context, if you could give us a brief history of the Barbados Red Cross Society as part of a much larger organization.
Give you the bullet point version. So we were established first as part of the British Red Cross Society in 1960, 1969. Of course, then you have us becoming an independent nation. So in 1969, Barbados Red Cross becomes, with the passage of the Barbados Red Cross Society Act, we come into existence for the first time as the Barbados Red Cross Society, which is auxiliary to government. And I think we will be one of the few organizations where there's an act, that created the organization. And that is a snapshot of our very long history. But we've been in existence since 1960, first as part of the British Red Cross Society, and then since 1969 as our own national society.
Well, one of the things the public is familiar with is your disaster response and management. Automatically, the average Barbadian, when they hear about the Barbados Red Cross, they think disaster and your assistance. Tell us about your involvement in disaster management and response.
One of the good things is that in a country like Barbados, we haven't necessarily had to have the same level of activity as maybe some of the other national societies, just because points of impact, right? But Red Cross does a lot of capacity building. So it's a lot of behind the scenes work. Actually, within the emergency management system, we're built in terms of the provision of first aid to Category 1 shelters. So we're not first responders in the same way that the Defense Force might be a first responder, but we're a support. And that's really the role of a Red Cross. In any country that Red Cross exists, they're generally auxiliary to government, which means that we supplement government services. So in terms of disaster response and disaster risk management, a lot of our work is around capacity building. We do training with community organizations, training with our volunteers. There's also the potential through our warehouse to have stock provided. When there's been impact in other islands, we provide tarpaulins. Post-COVID and post-ELSA, we would have provided hygiene and cleaning kits. So a lot of supplementary activity, a lot of background activity, even though we are not necessarily first responders.
Because you work extremely close with the Department of Emergency Management.
Yes, we do. Yes.
Tell me about that relationship.
That relationship is a long-standing one. Again, in more recent times, we've been collaborating more closely. So through community disaster response teams, we've done training for the district emergency organizations. And the way that a community disaster response team, which we call a CDRT, the way that works is really to feed upward to support the DEO. Because really, well, if you think about it, if there is impact, what's likely to happen is that a community is going to be cut off. So within at the local level, you really need to have people who are empowered and who have the skills and the capacity to really provide that support before the first responders arrive on the scene. So we've been doing work with DM in terms of training, in terms of we've sat on different boards, not boards, but different committees that they've had with work that they're doing. We support their training. We recently had a logistics and warehouse training, and their staff was able to participate. And we're really consistently trying to build a relationship because a strong Barbados Red Cross really is able to support and strengthen the very necessary Department of Emergency Management.
You mentioned that you were actively involved post Hurricane Elsa.
Mm-hmm.
Go into some detail about your involvement.
Okay. So post Hurricane Elsa, a lot of our involvement was really around welfare as opposed to, again, first responders. We would have provided hygiene kits and cleaning kits to a lot of the people, to 67 families that were affected. And tarpaulin, we provided tarpaulin to the Department of Emergency Management. But then we also partnered with the Ministry of People Empowerment and Elder Affairs and the Ministry of Labor to really, this right here where we're sitting was transformed into a hub where civil society, different organizations gathered here, and this was the collection point for donations. So through a drive which was led by the Ministry of Labor, and we were one of the key civil society organizations participating in it, there was a call issued to the public for donations, food kind or clothing. We got majority clothing. And yeah, so we were kind of, and a lot of the stuff is still stored here. So we were the coordinating hub. We did a lot of the work in terms of the mobilization of the volunteers. And again, that is really how Red Cross really works. You know, we are here to really support ministries and government agencies in what they're in their mandate.
Earlier, you mentioned about first aid training.
Mm-hmm.
Just before Hurricane Elsa, you actually had volunteers positioned at the Hurricane 1 shelters.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about what and why.
Well, I mean, for us at the beginning of the hurricane season, one of our first things that we do is we reach out to volunteers to make sure that they're still able, because of course we have a roster of our first aid trained volunteers, and also checking their willingness and their availability, because things can change from year to year. So one of the first activities at the beginning of the year is to reach out to the volunteers and assign them to Category 1 shelters. We received the list from the Ministry of Education at the beginning of the hurricane season, which are the Category 1 shelters for that year. It's important to note that, you know, it is only Category 1 shelters that we are assigned to. And I guess that is also set in the context of, you know, Barbados's most recent history with hurricanes. So what that really looks like is when a system is brewing, you know, we make contact with our volunteers. We have a WhatsApp group where they're able to communicate with each other. They're assigned to their shelters before the hurricane, before even the threat of impact. And, you know, there's the Ministry of Education has already pre-positioned first aid kits in the shelters, but we also make sure that our volunteers have their first aid shelter kits. And then there's just constant communication during the course of it. So what Elsa looks like is definitely movement to the shelters. We would have had, this is a lovely collaboration with the Department of Emergency Management. We're one of the teams that was trained as a CDRT, which fits within the DEO of Orange Hill. The Orange Hill St. James / St. Andrew. I think it fits into the St. Andrew DEO. We pre-positioned volunteers, first aid volunteers at the Category 1 shelter for that area. So that really shows the way that we can work together, where through the training, we were also able to support their mandate. And that's what it looks like. We just make sure that our volunteers know where they have to go, that they have the correct equipment, that they're facilitated in getting there and in getting back. And yeah, we fit within the national system.
Do you think enough persons in Barbados are trained in first aid?
No. But I think that there's definitely an interest and a demand in it, and it's growing. The good thing is, and I guess this is, the onus is on uh, business owners to really make use of it, because there is an actual act, the Safety and Health Act, which really does call for someone in every staff member, in every team, there should be someone who's trained in first aid. And depending on the size of the team, of course, then it increases in terms of how many people should be. Um, but I think that a lot of the times we take first aid for granted. But the reality is that every individual trained in first aid outside of disaster and even in normal times, so outside of disaster and definitely during a disaster, every person trained in first aid represents the possibility, to save a life. So we have seen an increase. We would have had a drop off in the last 2 years, of course, because we were not able to do training in the same way. We were not able to have the same numbers trained. But definitely, I think as more businesses call for their staff to be trained, we definitely have seen an increase in the demand for first aid.
And you have a beautiful ambulance stationed behind you, but this ambulance does not respond to emergencies in the traditional sense.
Not in the traditional sense. So what we can do, or what we generally will do, is we're usually positioned at an event. So if someone is having an event and they need first aid coverage, we will position the ambulance along with first aiders at the event. Recently, we supported an organization, the Ashley Lashley Foundation. They would have had a mobile activity. So the ambulance would have followed during that activity to make sure that first aid coverage was provided. And also if someone has, let's say, an elderly person or someone who did not, so it's not for critical emergencies, but if someone needs to be moved between point A and point B, the ambulance is also available for that.
So you can call in such a situation.
Yeah, for that situation. But definitely at this point, not for critical emergencies.
Okay. Now, since we're on the topic of health, you also have a medical aid scheme. What is it?
What that really is for the equipment that we have. And this is not one of our very active programs now. It's one of the older programs, but as private sector companies kind of came in that were, this would have been more in a time when there was less ability to access certain medical equipment. So things like walkers, canes, crutches, those kinds of things, we used to rent those out on a more active basis.
And you also lend assistance to fire victims.
So again, this would be something more on demand. And that's mainly in the area of clothing. So because we generally receive donations for clothing, one of the things that's usually going to be the first thing lost in a fire will be people's existing clothing. And one of the things I'm excited to talk more about is our thrift shop. Expected launch date for that is the end of August. But it's really to be able to help bring some degree of normalcy back into people's lives. So the fire service, the fire relief is more around the provision of clothing. It's around hygiene kits. It's around cleaning kits. So again, it's a supplementary service. We don't offer we would not be the first point, but we're definitely able. And what we definitely do is provide assistance for families who have lost everything in a fire.
And you also provide assistance to those who are less fortunate through your Meals on Wheels program, which is very popular still. Tell me about the program.
Well, I think Meals on Wheels service is probably one of the things that people it's synonymous with Barbados Red Cross. Meals on Wheels service is one of our, if not our longest running program. And it's one I think that we hold very near and dear to our heart. We have some really strong partnerships that feed into the Meals on Wheels service. And what it is a guarantee of a meal during the course of the week, a cooked meal. Our drivers, both our driver, Ralph, and our support drivers, many of them who come from Rotary, go around to the different recipients and they drop off a meal. Um, and then during the course of the weekend, when we're not able to provide that service, uh, we provide them with the donation for purity helps in that way
Right.
because we're able to provide something that at least they can make sandwiches or something to supplement the cooked meals. Um, we receive a subvention from the Ministry of Health. So we do receive a government subvention. But, it's a program that's really run at cost. I think a lot of the times when we think of organizations like Red Cross, these long-standing organizations, we don't necessarily think that they're going to be hit by global and economic realities in the way that an individual would be. I think we also don't necessarily think of ourselves as businesses. So in the same way that businesses have to cut and contrive and budget, and that they're really negatively impacted by access to food, the cost of petrol. These are things that are directly impacting us now because the Meals on Wheels service, we run that at cost. And although we do receive a subvention, the cost, if you think about the cost of an individual household and what individual households are really going through right now in terms of meeting the demand for food, so let's multiply that by the 57 families that we are providing for at cost. So petrol is the other thing that we've seen steady increases in the cost of petrol. So the delivery of the food is definitely one thing that is the cornerstone of a Meals on Wheels. The preparation of the food, the cornerstone of a Meals on Wheels. So it has become, although it is the one that's near and dear, one of our programs that's near and dear to our heart, it's one of the more challenging programs now. I think one of the strengths of it is we have very dedicated staff. We have, as I said, very long-standing, loyal, committed partners who really have made it their business to continue to support that program because it's one of those programs that even though most of us are not aware of it, if it were not there, the impact would be very noticeable because who do we serve? Elderly people, shut-ins, people who are not going to re-enter the job market. So, their ability to bounce back from the loss of that service, it would be quite severe impact.
You mentioned donations. I want to give that its own treatment.
Mm-hmm.
But focusing on the Meals on Wheels program, just to be clear, 57 recipients, is that the absolute maximum that we can do at this time?
At this time, yeah. At this time, yeah. We don't have the ability, so it has always been on demand. We have families who call and say, maybe even people not based in Barbados, who know that they have an elderly person in the home who needs support. So before it's just been on referral or it's been on direct request. But the ability to expand also will depend on our ability to meet the demand. So at this point, yeah, we don't have the capacity to expand the program at this time. We're very focused on trying to make sure that we continue to serve the needs of our existing beneficiaries, but to really expand the program at this point, not with the current realities.
You mentioned that you get direct referrals.
Mm-hmm.
In an instance like that, does the Red Cross then do its own screening to ensure that this person really does need this assistance?
So what will generally happen? So of course, we have our internal process. Our internal process is the Meals on Wheels staff will go and they'll do an assessment of the home to make sure that there really is the demand. We've also worked with organizations in the past to do assessments where we really go in and check what are the health needs. So we've had a nutrition intern in the last year who would have assessed the beneficiaries to find out what were the health challenges that they may be facing, high levels of NCD. So, most of our beneficiaries have existing issues. So typically what it would be is you would have either an organization or an individual that reach out to us because they know that they have a loved one who is in need of help, or social workers may reach out because they have someone that they're working with who they can tell would benefit from the program. In terms of, again, you know, it's challenging. And I think that that's one of the things that we've been struggling with, you know, that conversation of, can we take on more people? Is not a conversation that we've ever had. So, I mean, once you qualified, you got onto the program. And I don't know if it is that most people didn't know. So the demand was always manageable. 57, it's a large number, but it's still a manageable number. And because most of our focus has been on elderly persons, shut-ins, it's not necessarily a program that would play some of the same role as maybe something that the welfare department might have in place for feeding younger persons and young families. This really has a very specific target audience, has had that in the past. Elderly persons, shut-in, people who are incapacitated. Um, so of course, you know, the thought of not being able to provide that kind of support, it has been rough internally for us to recognize that, you know, what would it mean to us to be able to what would it mean for us to expand at this time? And would it be better for us to concentrate on continuing the service? We may have to modify the service at some point. Our our goal is always to keep who we have on the program on the program. Our goal is definitely to make sure that if you're on the program, we can continue to feed you during the week. We may have to make difficult decisions, just like most organizations are at this point in time, in terms of our ability to do that. One way of controlling it for us right now has been to not expand the program, but definitely with the hope that, you know, I think organizations, whenever they can, we have some great organizations that reach out and will just give a donation, however small. Um, and that will always go towards, you know, offsetting the cost of the Meals on Wheels program. It is our most expensive program to run. And whereas First Aid generates income, it's not a program that generates income. So it's got the cost of staff, it's got the cost of supplies, it's got the cost, like I mentioned, of gasoline. Um, but it's not one that we earn income from. So really you can see then that it's a flow outwards. There's, apart from donations when we receive them, there's not as much of the ability for resources to flow into the program. um, which is why I want to keep mentioning how valuable those partnerships have been, because you have organizations like Shafet Shikmont, who, you know, with the provision of the meat, you know, with the provision of purity, with the provision of the bread, it really allows us to continue to function. Rotary, with their drivers, with the provision of, you know, the ability to take the food out. It's like those partners can't be separated from the program where it is now. I think what it really, what we need to do more successfully, and what we need to do, you know, for the future of the program is definitely to find new partners, establish relationships wherever possible with providers that, you know, we may not always be able to purchase at cost, you know, but there are ways that, you know, you can offset those relationships where you have consistent relationships with the same providers. And I think, you know, that has to be the approach that we shift into if we hope to be able to continue this service. Because the reality is, it would be a loss. It would be a loss if the Meals on Wheels organizations like Salvation Army, Feeding Pro, if those organizations are not able to meet the needs of those people who we don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis, but are really the cornerstone. They're there, you know, they are a part of our society. And I think a lot of the times we don't notice how organizations such as us are behind the scenes doing the work that allows things to function, you know, supporting organizations like a welfare, because welfare, no organization can meet the needs alone, you know, so it really is a collective effort. One of our core areas has been this one, but the loss of the program is one that would be felt.
And that's why we have you on the program this evening to explain all of the work you're doing behind the scenes. But still a lot more to discuss. You're watching One on One. Stay with us.
When does a mental health issue become a problem? When should you reach out for help? I'm Krisnan Hurdle, clinical psychologist and certified life coach. Mental health issues interrupt a person's daily functions. An issue becomes a disorder when a person isn't able to carry out their everyday activities like household duties, personal upkeep and hygiene, or interferes with their ability to function socially, to interact with others inside the household, or interferes with their ability to function on the job or carry out other activities. If a person finds themselves needing to self-isolate, losing touch with reality, or having an impaired ability to think, reason, or function, and if this occurs over a period of days, weeks, or months, then it is time that they reach out for help.
Director General of the Barbados Red Cross Society, Ms. Danielle Toppin. Ms. Toppin, we're dealing with crisis management, crisis response. That's where the society comes in. COVID-19 I want to say was, but is a crisis. How did the Red Cross Society respond to COVID-19?
I'm glad that you refer to it as a crisis, and not just a health crisis. I think it was it had a lot of the characteristics of any disaster. If even we weren't quick to think of it as outside of just health. So for COVID, there were different levels of intervention that we were involved in. We would have worked very closely with the Prime Minister's office, the Household Mitigation Unit. And again, because of our role as an auxiliary organization, it always works best if when we're developing a beneficiary list, that we also use the existing lists that the government has in place. So we worked with the Household Mitigation Unit because, of course, the demand that they faced, and we're speaking like at the beginning, so 2020, the demand that would have been faced by the closure of the tourism industry, so many people who had been out of work, for the first time, and who, required assistance for the first time. So we worked with them to identify, people in need. We provided cash-based support through the support of the International Federation of the Red Cross. We were able to provide cash-based support for 53 families, and it was done in a way that rather than get a one-off, they received an ATM card that was a pre-programmed card. They would have come in, we would have done assessments with them before, identifying who could have been placed on the beneficiary list. So we provided cash transfers for these families, and they received it in tranches. Again, it only is ever a drop. But, we were trying to bring it as close as possible to the support that the government was providing, and then to spread it as wide as it could. So we had those beneficiaries. We worked with the Anti-Human Trafficking Project, Dr. Olivia Smith, to make sure that it wasn't just because something like a national ID card can really, we don't think of those things necessarily if you have one as a barrier. But, it's important to work with organizations that are also working with migrants and people who may not be here people who are here without status. We were able to work together to make sure that they also were integrated into some of our programming. Because if you're here and you're working and you're involved in the informal labor force, and the country closes, you don't necessarily have the capacity to bounce back. So as hard as it is for national, there's another level of challenge that's faced by people who are here without status. So we were able to work with partners such as that organization to make sure that we also provided support for people who are not here with status. So the cash-based support was one. We provided home garden kits to 52 families again, because one of our areas of focus, I mean, one of our strategic goals is around the issue of resilience. Um, and I mentioned the limitation of what we were able to give. Um, we very strongly felt that if you provided families with also the capacity to feed themselves, even if we would have wanted to provide a larger cash transfer or cash based support, there are limitations. So in that we had to make the focus on, trying to provide a little to as many families. For we didn't want to do a one-off, so that you were able to at least get 2 cycles of the program. But the provision of home garden kits to 50 families was really around our thing of resilience, and community resilience is one of our strategic goals. It's in our it's part of, and not just Barbados Red Cross, the International Federation of the Red Cross. There's a focus on building resilience. How do people bounce back when crisis happens? Because it's one thing to provide emergency relief, but if people don't have the capacity to bounce back, then you will have people who stay in the system longer than they need to stay in the system, who stay dependent longer than they need to stay dependent. So, our thinking in that at that time was, okay, well, how about we provide the ability to use what's around you. And I mean, we also provided a flyer. So the flyer was definitely a focus on using organic compost. So instead of throwing away your eggshell, I grew up with my grandfather going and picking up, manure. He would go down to the garrison and he would get the manure. Then it wasn't nice to play around, but there was always horse manure all over his garden. We could not throw away an eggshell, because eggshells went into the garden. He didn't know anything about chemical fertilizers, and I think that becomes a level of dependence. So if we always rely on something to purchase in order to meet whatever is the crisis or the problem that we're facing, it limits our ability to bounce back. So we provided them with soil. We provided them with a booklet that, kind of said, how can you look around to use what you have? I'm sitting here talking to you and I can see Leaf of Life, Wonder World, that has purpose. And, aloes, we may not think of these things as medicine. We may not think of these things as something that can feed your family, but they can. Spinach, so we gave, I think, things like spinach seeds, things that they could put together to make a meal for your family. We also thought about it in terms of things that were 6-week crops, because we didn't want to give like eddos or yams, because that's a longer crop. So 50 families would have benefited from that during that period of time. And then we also did like distributions. We had our volunteers going down into Cheapside Market with the kits. So, people could pass by and we were giving it out there. We did donations of masks. We also had community outreach then. We did donations to the Barbados Association to End Hopelessness, Kimar Safri's organization, of masks, of sanitizers, because we also received those types of donations. Psychosocial support. That was one of the big areas that we did work around. So we provided counseling and we paid for, again, drop in the pan, in the ocean, but we provided targeted. So if people, and it started off when people were coming in for the cash-based support, we had people, I think a lot of us needed counseling at the end of that too, because you had people who came in who were very, and the Barbadian culture, they had never asked for support. And more than that, they're usually the ones that may have felt they would have been in a position to help.
Give. Mm-hmm.
So we had tourism employees, we had a lot of people who were involved in a lot of people who were either working in the tourism sector or they were self-employed. And we're talking at the period of time when, you know, there was very strict guidelines on movement. So they really weren't able to earn income. It was fine if you were able to work from a laptop, you know, at home. That's the thing we never think about, how many people, based on the very manual nature of what they do, they were not able to work at all. So based on that, we realized that that was kind of a response to what we saw when we were doing the cash-based support, that there was the need for people to get counseling. And for people who, you know, there were people who really felt that they were at risk of self-harming because they didn't know, there was no foreseeable end to the crisis, right? They had weakened um, social safety networks, weakened family networks. So we worked with a counseling agency, and we paid for the sessions for people who expressed the need for one-on-one counseling. And if they were in extreme crisis still at the end, because sometimes people just need someone to talk through, okay, how can I get out of this situation? I'm here now, what is a different way of looking at this? But if at the end of the 3 sessions, they really still felt that they needed additional sessions, on referral, we were able to cover those sessions. We also would have trained 27 of our own volunteers to be able to, you know, because we think a lot about our beneficiaries. We don't often think about the impact of crises on responders. And that could be nurses, doctors, you know, I have a way of thinking about this, that most of us, whether we acknowledge it or not, are still in a state of post-traumatic stress disorder. People are still, COVID, if you notice, has become a reference point. So, you know, you hear people making the joke before COVID, BC, before COVID. So it has changed the way that we think, the way that we, you know, the way people relate. If you remember during COVID, people's even anxiety about people coming too close to you and whatever. Those things play on the psyche. So we saw that as an important area that we could support in. And that's actually an area that's built into even our disaster response training. So I made mention earlier of the community disaster response training. One module is in psychosocial support, because, you know, and psychological first aid, because we think about first aid of the body, but what about what could be the healthy coping mechanisms that people need to develop in the event of a crisis? And we definitely saw that during COVID. So we, like I mentioned, the PPEs, the hygiene, the cleaning kits, the food. We did a lot of hampers. And at the beginning, we would have done a donation of hampers, and that was, we received actually support from the port. So of course, if you think about it, all of these ships, the cruise liners that were grounded here, we were able to provide fresh food and vegetables and fruit, you know, but that was at the beginning of the crisis. But, you know, we also provided supermarket vouchers. We provided hampers at different points. So as we received donations, we were able to also provide. So we had a partnership with the Coca-Cola Foundation and the Manufacturers Association, where we were able to provide food hampers. We would have received donations from so many organizations, of water, of different things. And as we received, we gave it out.
But your operations, however, since COVID have been impacted significantly. Donations are down a lot.
And we're not the only one. I think we've heard a lot of organizations issuing that same cry, that donations are down. One of the things we used to get a lot was individual donations. So as people had money, they may give something, they may come and bring a $50, and we had the bins in different companies. But over time, we removed them because we realized that over time. Whereas once upon a time, you maybe used to get a couple $100 from each can, and I think these are the little ways that you can see impact. How is the culture changing? How is the society changing? Um, so we did remove the cans from most of the supermarkets and the stores where they were placed. Um, but individual donors would have been one of the things we would have relied on. Companies were able to, as I mentioned, the government subvention, but the government subvention, I mean, it's the Ministry of Health. And if you think about the ministry that really would have borne a lot of the weight,
It was the
they,
Ministry of Health.
they would have been very hard hit. So, we would have had reductions in our subvention. Um, at a time, I guess, when, we also
Needed it most.
needed the most. So, things like that. There's so many factors, that go into to shape the difference. So you have your reductions of individual donations, you have your reductions of corporate sponsors. One of the things that we really had is even something as simple as during the height of COVID, a lot of our drivers, this was something we'd never experienced before. People were scared. People were scared to go into other people's homes, but people were also scared to have us come into their home because this was a huge question mark, nothing we'd ever seen before. When you think about donations and when you think about funding post-COVID, there's so many competing factors, some of them unrelated, that affect us. So, the reduction in the cut to the subvention, the increasing costs of food, reductions in some of our traditional sources of income, first aid. So first aid training would be one of our main sources of instruction. Also the end or the pause on crop over. So in 2020, in 2021, we had no crop over, but the provision, and we had no sporting events, large scale sporting events. But
So no need for the ambulance. Yeah.
and even then, there was no activity for that whole period of time. So now, I'm really thankful this year we're supporting NCF again in some of their crop over events. We've had calls from schools and football clubs and different, so it's happening, but it's a slow recovery, and there's a lot of ground to cover in order to recover. And then, if you think about it, a charity, we hear so many private sector companies speaking about the impact on them. So then that limits their ability to support organizations such as us. So, corporate social responsibility, I think organizations like Red Cross, civil society organizations, we really have to ask ourselves, what's the benefit to our donors of really engaging with us? Yes, there is the social good, but the reality is, each organization represents a constituency in and of itself. Each civil society organization represents a constituency in and of itself. So in terms of, increased accountability to our donors, increased publicity for our donors, these are, and it's room for opportunity. It's opportunity for growth. These are maybe we become complacent in the ways that we do things. And these are opportunities for us to also engage our sponsors and our donors differently, where we're more consistent with recognizing them, but in also reaching out to them. We made mention earlier about the First Aid and the Safety and Health Act. How many companies even know that this, or how proactive are we in ensuring that we reach out to these companies, is to say, this is what you're required to do by law. We're a good person for you to partner with. And this is the benefit of working with the Barbados Red Cross. We also offer a service. We are a charity, but we provide a service, and it's a long-standing service. It is a service that I firmly believe can hold its own against any of the people doing first aid instruction. So, it's also for us to start to look at ourselves as not to start, but to continue to grow that part, where we see ourselves as a service provider, and not just a charitable organization.
How many volunteers do you have, and do you have enough?
You want the ones that we have on the books, or you want, I mean, on the books, we have over 50 volunteers. There's this thing called spontaneous volunteerism.
Right.
If we have an event, we get volunteers. So post Elsa, Hurricane Elsa, there's not going to be a shortage of volunteers. I think what Hurricane Elsa also, one of the blessings out of something that could be seen as a curse is we were able to reach out and meet so many new volunteers because different organizations, I mean, we have attracted some really dynamic young volunteers through something that was a crisis. So on the books, we have over 50 volunteers. I would say we have about 25 to 30 committed, consistent volunteers. We have some volunteers who are, I mean, there's no way that we could continue to do what we do without that spirit of volunteerism. The ways that our volunteers, step in. It's humbling, really. It's humbling. And I think there's so much, we focus so much on what's negative. Yeah, and they're not always older people. We see so many young, dynamic, motivated young volunteers who come and, we work with the Give Back program at UE. If even they come for a period of time, when they're here, their contribution counts. Who may have a skill in computers, and they develop a database for us. And really, we don't have enough. So in one answer, you asking, no, we don't have enough. But I think we're also moving into a phase of being more clear in the type of volunteer, because a lot of the time we would have had youth volunteers or community volunteers, but also in, being more not proactive, but thinking through, how could we engage retired persons? There's so many people who they're not actively working, but they really, I mean, it's interesting we're having this, but while I was waiting for you to come, someone came up to the door and said she's bored, she's at home, she's tired. And it wasn't, I wouldn't call her elderly, but an older, mature, that's the word, a mature person. And just thinking, how can they give back? Because they still have so much to offer. If even you've left the workforce, you still have so much to offer. And the organization, that's, I think, the beauty about a Red Cross is the organization also has a lot to offer volunteers. So, I made mention of some of the young dynamic volunteers. We have one who's going to be able to go to Panama next month to do training. He's participated, we have volunteers who participated in logistics training, so that, if you have an area of interest in the environment or geography, and it really is in line with what the organization does, there are opportunities, because the beauty about Red Cross is it is a global movement, and it is a movement that has a heavy focus on capacity building. So training is really at the heart of there's a lot of training opportunities, even virtually. There's the International Federation of the Red Cross has a learning platform where you can go on and you can do hundreds of courses for free. Their certificate, it's an IFRC certificate, but it's still, exposure, so that if people, are considering a career path within the Red Cross, you have a global movement. We have volunteers who started with with a national society, who've ended up working with the International Federation in Uganda, different parts of the world, because there is that connection with other national societies. So I say all of that to say we don't have enough, but I'm very encouraged by the direction that I see, us moving in, with engaging volunteers, with making sure that their interests are being met, not just ours. Yeah, I think we're on a good path with our volunteers, but definitely we have the need for more.
My final question to you.
Mm-hmm.
You've been on the job for just over a year. As Director General, what is your vision for the Red Cross?
My vision for the vision for the National Society overall is, to be the leading voluntary organization locally. Or what does that mean? And a voluntary organization that helps to build resilience. I think what that means is my vision is a place where, yes, it's a given that we are an auxiliary organization. It's a given that we do play a role within the wider society. Um, Really, for us to not necessarily to become a household name, but definitely for there to be a familiarity with what the organization does. Um, and to and this goes beyond our organ, but this is for the field as a whole, for people to understand really that humanitarian work is essential. That work in the development field, in the humanitarian field, generally you have people who are committed, you have people who are dedicated, who definitely don't get, there's not necessarily the same monetary reward, but there is definitely the possibility for, for development, personal and professional. When I think through leading voluntary organization, for me, I could tell you what it looks like. I see a space that is one where our volunteers are thriving, where our volunteers are thriving personally and professionally. Because I don't want this to be a place where you come and you don't grow. Um, for that personal and professional development to really feed in to our ability to meet the needs of an ever-changing society, because societies evolve. COVID was not a thing 2.5 years ago. And if we look at it, are we going back to where we were before? Things have changed. There are whole industries that have become, a whole sector, a whole industry post-COVID. So I really want to see a national society that is dynamic, that has the correct systems in place where it can attract, it can attract it can pay competitive salaries. It can attract dynamic, sources of a dynamic organization where people want to be, where people, feel the impact of being helped by the National Society, and where people also feel that commitment to give back. Because, you know, what would keep an organization like a Red Cross going and growing? We help so many, but really that whole thing about it being, a cycle. If you've been supported, you more than anyone understand the necessity of an organization like a Red Cross. And it's not, we don't need one type of volunteer. People who understand the impact of a Red Cross, really their testimonial is priceless. So really a place where young people feel loved, respected, where there's value to them being here, where volunteers who are no longer in the professional field but still have so much to give back, that they feel that their experience, their knowledge is valued, it's respected, and they still have a role to play. They can still contribute. Where students, can see that, this focus on academics is not going to take away from it. But what does it mean to be a Barbadian citizen? What does it mean to really occupy this space called Barbados? Like, what is yes, we know that we get free education, we know that we have free healthcare, but what do you owe the state? So for Red Cross to really be a central organization in really building that culture, because as much as we are involved in first aid, as much as we're involved in disaster preparedness and response, as much as we've spoken a lot about Meals on Wheels, all of our initiatives are impossible without a dynamic volunteer base. So really to be able to continue to build that, and to have an organization that has the systems in place to support them, to have a culture in place that is supportive, and for them to help build that culture. Because it's not for me alone to build that. I am one person and I'm going to move on. We have volunteers who've been here over 30, 40 years. What do they have to teach a young volunteer? And really to be, for my vision for me and my vision for the organization is for me to be a part of that process, and for that process to take place.
Well, Ms. Toppin, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening and sharing with Barbados the work of the Red Cross Society and all that you do.
Thank you for your interest. It was a pleasant surprise to be asked. And it's nice to know that people still are aware of the importance of an organization like the Red Cross.
You're most welcome. That was Miss Danielle Toppin, the Director General of the Barbados Red Cross Society. I'm Lisa Lord. You are watching One on One. Do have yourself a wonderful evening.